Later, when the anger of King Xerxes had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what he had decreed about her. Then the king's personal attendants proposed, "Let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint commissioners in every province of his realm to bring all these beautiful girls into the harem at the citadel of Susa. Let them be placed under the care of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and let beauty treatments be given to them. Then let the girl who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." This advice appealed to the king, and he followed it. Now there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin, named Mordecai, son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, among those taken captive with Jehoiachin, king of Judah. Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This girl, who was also known as Esther, was lovely in form and features, and Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died. When the king's order and edict had been proclaimed, many girls were brought to the citadel of Susa and put under the care of Haggai. Esther also was taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Haggai, who had charge of the harem. The girl pleased him and won his favor. Immediately he provided her with her beauty treatments and special food. He assigned to her 7 maids selected from the king's palace and moved her and her maids into the best place in the harem. Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. Every day he walked back and forth near the courtyard of the harem to find out how Esther was and what was happening to her. Before a girl's turn came to go in to King Xerxes, she had to complete 12 months of beauty treatments prescribed for the women, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 with perfumes and cosmetics. And this is how she would go to the king. Anything she wanted was given her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go there, and in the morning return to another part of the harem to the care of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She would not return to the king unless he was pleased with her and summoned her by name. When the turn came for Esther, the girl Mordecai had adopted, the daughter of her uncle Abihail, to go to the king, she asked for nothing other than what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the harem, suggested. And Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. She was taken to King Xerxes in the royal residence in the 10th month, the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. This is the word of the Lord. Well, of all the names of cities in America, Providence, Rhode Island, may be the most interesting. The name comes from a preacher renegade by the name of Roger Williams. It so happens that Roger Williams arrived in Massachusetts colony in the 1600s, disgusted by his fellow Congregationalists. Their tolerance of the Church of England at that time and their treatment of the Native Americans riled him. As a 26-year-old firebrand, controversy followed him wherever he went. It became such a big problem in the colony that Roger Williams was banished from Massachusetts. Williams found shelter with the Narragansett Indians, whom he had shared the gospel with. And meeting with other exiles, Williams started a new settlement, and he called it Providence. And he named it Providence, as he wrote, because of God's merciful providence to me in my distress. I designed it might be a shelter for persons distressed for their conscience. It's very interesting when we think about that story, because like the characters that we encounter in the book of Esther, and really, don't we know it, in the entire Bible, look at the characters, looking closely at their real lives. They were not perfect people, not at all. And Roger Williams was no perfect man. But what he discerned was true. God absolutely had his hand in the making of a new city and eventually a new nation. Brothers and sisters, we do a dishonor to the book of Esther if we do not emphasize that this is a story of God's providence. It's not a story about Esther. It's not a story about Mordecai. It's a story about God. Well, what we ask is providence. What is providence? Providence is the conviction that God sustains the world that he has created, the people who respond to him, and directs them to their appointed destiny. It's interesting, too, when we look at the early forefathers of our country. So often they would speak of God as providence. One of the things that they really were drawn to was that God had a providential hand on them and this nation. God moves and he acts in this world. He's not some sort of deist who created and then somehow disappeared. No, he is engaged and active in your lives. So as we continue in Esther 2, we meet two individuals who are swept up in the unfolding of God's higher, greater redemptive plan. No matter who we are and the choices we make, God's providence will always prevail. No matter who we are and the choices that we make, God's providence will always prevail. So looking at the text, after a disastrous defeat, King Xerxes returned to Susa, a lonely man. Now, I read up to verse 16. I know that was quite a chunk of text this morning, but I read up to verse 16 quite intentionally, as this last verse, interesting, gives information about the timing of this whole chapter. We read how Esther was taken to King Xerxes right there at the end of the text, verse 16, during the 7th year of his reign. Now, you might recall, it's okay if you don't, but you might recall that in Esther chapter 1, the preceding chapter, those events took place in the 3rd year of King Xerxes' reign. So really, between chapter 1 and chapter 2, there has been a 4-year gap of time. But actually, quite a lot happened in those 4 years. During that time, Xerxes led a massive military campaign against Greece. Despite an initial Pyrrhic victory, if you will, at the pass of Thermopylae, catastrophic defeats followed, forcing Xerxes to return to his capital of Susa. I mean, it's quite amazing, really, when you read the history. He had led one of the largest invasions, almost 500,000 soldiers over into Greece, and yet he failed. And Xerxes would go down as a failure militarily. While this is an imperfect analogy, the mood of Persia, and I think it's important that we get a sense, if we can get ourselves into this story, the mood of Persia would not be that dissimilar, if you will, from the United States in the latter days of the Vietnam War. The United States and Persia were superpowers that were accustomed to winning. It's hard to argue that America really felt good over Vietnam, and Persia certainly didn't in Greece. Thus, we engage with a country in Esther chapter 2 that is in very different spirits than the country that we found in Persia 1, celebrating and exorbitant banquets that we had seen before. There is a depression, a defeatedness here in Persia, and maybe none more so than King Xerxes himself. King Xerxes returned home from his defeat. And it's very interesting that when we read that he remembered Vashti, I believe that also is a reflection that he very much was aware not only that he had lost and failed, but there was no queen to return home to. Now, I say this without pity for him. He was responsible for his choices, and believe me, last week we learned some pretty vile things he had done. Rather, it is to give some proper context to the understanding of Esther chapter 2. Because his personal attendants are watching him, and they say, okay, well, let's fix the problem. Let's find our king a new queen. And so they recommend in verses 2 and 3, let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint commissioners in every province of his realm to bring all these beautiful young women into the harem at the citadel of Susa. Now, the emphasis in the Hebrew here, we don't sometimes see this, but it actually repeatedly mentions the beauty. Only the beautiful of the beautiful would be brought before the king. And one of these beautiful women was a woman named Hadassah. We learn, of course, and we know her as Esther. In verse 7, Esther is described as having a lovely figure and is beautiful. In other words, as these women gathered from all over this empire for a beauty pageant, if you will, Esther's appearance would have fit in. Now, we mustn't make too much of this. After all, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. I found this kind of interesting, a little humorous, when I saw this week, that a young missionary to West Africa who had a small, trim wife said that the nationals actually told him that she was a bad reflection on him. He obviously was not providing well enough for her. The people of West Africa live by this proverb that if your wife is on a camel and the camel cannot stand up, then you know that your wife is truly beautiful. Very different. Very different. The narrator is simply showing that Esther's attractiveness was useful for God's sovereign, providential plan. You see, the problem with us so often is that we play the comparison game. We compare each other, and men and women are both guilty of this all the time. We compare each other, and then we think maybe that person is more part of God's providence than me. Or things like that, where it bridges and it brings up envy and jealousy and ugly things. When really the truth of the matter is that God made you in his image. As you are, you cannot be more valuable as you are in God's eyes than you are. Esther was very valuable to God, but so are you. No matter who you are, no matter your form or your type or your personality, you are beautiful in God's eyes because you have his image imprinted in you. I love what Courtney Rasig says, writing in an article titled, "God is the author and origin of beauty." She wisely observes that we know that there were beautiful women in the Bible, and we know that God is the author of beauty. But it's critical to remember that outward beauty is not everything. Being beautiful is not a sin, but for example, if Esther had sought her own gain and refused to help her people, her beauty would have meant nothing. Where's her true beauty? Where's her true beauty? Being a soul who loved her God. That's where the true beauty lies. Indeed, as we continue to learn about Esther and her cousin, we see two people as imperfect as you and as me. So first we are introduced to Mordecai. Mordecai shows us what it's like to be a person who is living in a foreign world. And quite suddenly in verse 5, there is this change, because we kind of have a scene shift, if you will. We've been in the palace quite a bit with King Xerxes, and now all of a sudden we meet Mordecai. Mordecai is an Israelite belonging to the tribe of Benjamin, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Now, when the text refers to the one who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem, you see that word who has been a matter of humongous debate. Because many people will object and say, they will actually say this entire book is false based on that one word who, thinking that it's referring to Mordecai. It's unlikely that it would be Mordecai, because if that were the case, then he would be over 120 years old. A far more explainable possibility, and it is a very real possibility, it fits with the grammar and everything else, is that the who that begins verse 6 actually refers to Kish, not to Mordecai. Now, Kish would have been Mordecai's great-grandfather. So despite the controversy that some make of this, it's totally unnecessary, because if you dig a little bit, there's a perfectly reasonable solution. Now, I kind of focus on that for a moment, because there's a bigger point that I would like to make that is quite relevant to us. Because while I expect, and I think most of us would, we would expect atheists, we would expect people of other religions to cast doubt on the truth of Scripture. It is quite alarming to me how many Christians fail to give the Bible the benefit of the doubt. In our American mindset, the Bible doesn't always fit cleanly. There can seem to be incoherencies. And sometimes we look and we say, oh, God's wrath. How do we fit that with God's love? That's just one of many things that we struggle with. And what I find time and time again is that when things do not make perfect sense, When I'm reading Scripture and things, oh, I don't know about that, I have a choice to make. Either I choose to be lazy, because that's what it is. It's laziness to simply cast doubt on God's word and say, I'm not comfortable with that. I'm not going to look any deeper. And then we have a host of consequences for that choice. Or I choose to cast doubt on my American eyes and my American assumptions of what is true. That's hard because we were raised American. Everything we see can be American. But the truth of the matter is, when we dig deeper, there's an answer. I believe consistently when we dig deeper, do the research, have an open heart to what God will teach us, do some work, there's logical explanations. At the end of the day, it is making that choice, that critical choice. Do you believe that this is God's word? More than just mere human words, that this is God's holy word to us. It will challenge you if you're open to that, and it will transform you as it has transformed me. Well, getting back to Mordecai, I want us to notice one more thing found in verses 5 and 6. Mordecai is a law-abiding, God-fearing man with a robust Jewish heritage. And yet we find him here, and I think it's very important that we acknowledge this. He is living in exile. Like every other Jew living in Susa, he was learning how to be faithful to his faith while engaging with his neighbors. And I'm sure the question occurred to him more than once. How then shall I live? Remember this, Jerusalem, we talk about Jerusalem in the Old Testament. It went beyond, for the Jews, just a place of significance. It's not just a place that's important, if you will. No, Jerusalem in the Jewish mindset was the very center of their identity. Take away Jerusalem, and you're taking away a huge part of what they were. The pilgrimages, the sacrifices, almost all of these things were centered around Jerusalem. In fact, you hear of the New Zion, right? Mount Zion. Again, Jerusalem. When a Jew would think about these things, they would think of their city. And yet here is Mordecai, who is a Jew, a faithful Jew, but he is living not in Jerusalem. And there is really very little of Jerusalem at this point that they could talk about. They were living in a pagan city with pagan practices. And I think the more that you sit on that reality, the more it actually hits home. It hits home to us as Christians living in a place that is not reflective of the Christian kingdom. Doesn't it feel that way to you? Ever more? Maybe even more this year than any before? The questions that we are engaging with. How can I live for Jesus and faithfully live in my community? How can I be a joyful Christian, a loving person, knowing what should be in our world, and yet looking around, turning on the TV and seeing a world every day that doesn't look anything like the world that it should be? And then, how do I avoid the negativity, the cancerous negativity that can surround me and my attitudes of everyone, if that's the case? You see, that's the great trap. I think that's why negativity seeps into the church. Because we see the world and we say it should be something different, and yet it isn't. That's the same as Mordecai. Mordecai is doing the same thing. He's dealing with that kind of world. He wants Jerusalem, but he's not there. He's in Susa. Same for Esther. And so before we cast judgment on these two characters, let's examine ourselves. How much are we really at the real point of being? A light in a dark world. So think about that. That we are called to be a light in the darkness. Not a light in the light, which is what we often do. We are surrounded by Christians. But are we a light in the darkness? That's the question. So let's keep the bigger picture of Providence at the forefront of our minds. Because in a very broken world, God was working in and through Esther. Now, it is, again, another caveat here. It's important at this juncture to be mindful that being Jewish, Mordecai and Esther belonged to a minority group. On a worldly level, the Jews were subservient to every law, every decree of Persia and its king. And what that meant is that whatever the king said, whatever the king wanted, the Jews, like everyone else in the empire, were to fall in line, and very likely, if they didn't, execution. I mean, that's the kind of power this man wields. Actions were taken regularly against their will because at the end of the day, they had no earthly power. So as Mordecai and Esther encounter the inner circle of Persian power, we'd be wise to consider these things. Because, and very admittedly, and I'm sure as you were reading this along with me, it's a difficult text. There's some difficult things here to hear. Esther, like the other beautiful virgins of the empire, was taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Haggai, who had charge of the harem. And after these prolonged beauty treatments that are prescribed, 6 months of myrrh, 6 months of oil, that sort of thing, verse 14 informs us that in the evening, she would go to the king's palace, and in the morning return to another part of the harem to the care of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. Now, I don't think I have to spell it out for you, but there's some things there that raise some serious moral curiosity. And I do think that there is some serious moral shadiness right there in verse 14. And it, for me, raised a host of questions this week. Was Esther complicit? Was Esther complicit in sleeping with a pagan king, which would have been a clear violation of Torah law? Look at Deuteronomy 7:3. Why didn't Esther refuse? Vashti refused the king. Why didn't Esther? Why did, or the very real possibility, another way of thinking about this, and certainly I tend to lean this way myself, was she doing this against her will? Was this forced upon her? And where is Mordecai in all of this? You see, as much as we would like, and certainly I would have, honestly, reading this, I would have liked, and I think many of us would have liked, a clear, cut and dry answer and an explanation. The narrator does not engage with the why. The narrator does not simply go down that road of why, and neither should we. God's providence accounts for free choice. And really, we miss the whole point of this story if we are engaging with Esther as something that she is not, some sort of heroine that is above all of us in terms of her perfections. I don't think that a Jew living at the time after this was written would have looked at Esther as a real model for everything they were to do and be. No, actually, I think quite honestly, this is a story about God and his providence. Maybe another way of thinking about this, because these are two questions that are in a sense contrasting. Is Esther, this book, a morality tale about how we should stand tall in the midst of our earthly captivity? Or is it a gospel message, ultimately about our need for dependence upon Jesus Christ, our mediator who accomplished our deliverance? You see the difference? What is this book about? The text itself suggests that this is about more than just Esther. And I think just to kind of help us through this, I want us to point to a few things here that I thought were very revealing and interesting, what the narrator does emphasize. Look at verse 9. Esther is said to have pleased Haggai, him being Haggai, and won his favor. Now, at first when I read that, and I think most of us probably did this, we focus on Esther, right? Focus on how Esther pleased this man and won his favor. But there's something deeper. There's something actually quite deep here. The word favor is the same word in the Hebrew, chesed. If that rings a bell, in the Old Testament, chesed is used quite often. And it is a word that describes overwhelmingly God's gracious, satisfying, steadfast, covenant promise love for his people. It is a word for his love. You know, we talk, and I've shared before with you, agape love. The Old Testament version of the Greek agape love is hesed. So when we talk about God's love in the Old Testament, we're talking with that word. What does this mean? What it means, I believe, is that God's providence was at work through Esther. Haggai and everyone and the king, it's repeated, that word favor. Why? Because God's handiwork was working through her. She was an imperfect person, as imperfect as you and me, and yet she had God's grace placed upon her. This again appears in verse 15. When the turn came for Esther to go to the king, she asked for nothing, which I thought is beautiful too. What a mark of humility. She asked for nothing other than what Haggai, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the harem, suggested. And Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. Esther was literally lifting up the grace of God in the eyes of all who saw her. No, they didn't just see her outward appearance. What made her really beautiful, what made her really set apart, was that she had God's favor upon her. The real hero of this story isn't Esther, it's God. It's God who redeems his people, who sets apart people for a part of something larger than themselves. God brought Esther, an orphan, all the way to the palace and making her queen of the Persian Empire. I mean, that's quite a story. And to think, she started out with just Mordecai and probably a humble little home. The gospel of Esther, the gospel, is that Jesus Christ has redeemed people like Mordecai, like Esther, like you, like me, who despite our failures, and every one of us have failures, we are living in a messy, broken world, and many of us every day are saying, I don't want to sin. I don't want to be stuck in my condition. But every day we are reliant upon that word in Romans 8. There is therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. We need that word, because every day we are stumbling along, and it's not really like this. There's a lot of ups and downs, peaks and valleys in our journey. As the title suggests, this is a story about how God guided a beautiful young Jewess, but in a dark and broken world. Obviously, we live in a very different culture than ancient Persia, but we don't live in a different world. We don't live in a different world. We might call these things by different names, but the sexuality that was going on in Persia, it's a real problem in our country. It is a massive, massive problem in the United States. The same God who is present in Esther has fulfilled our salvation on that cross. Of course, we are not removed from the brokenness of the world. And I think this is, again, that application, that takeaway. Jesus prayed on behalf of his disciples in John chapter 17, I have given them your word, and the world has hated them, for they are not of the world any more than I am of the world. My prayer is not that you take them out of the world, but that you protect them from the evil one. They are not of the world, even as I am not of it, yet I have sent them into the world. Clearly, we are to be in this world, and yet there is something about us that should be set apart from the world. So how should we respond to the sins of our society? Should we make war on where America is headed, as some Christians are apt to do? Or should we segregate our church life from our secular life and sprinkle in our secular work with a little bit of Jesus? I think Jesus' teaching tells us that there's a different answer. The right answer, God's way, is for Christians to look and be different than the ungodly. Yet at the same time, Jesus says, I have sent them into this world. And the question then, are you in it? Our destination is to those who do not know, even have an open rebellion against our God. We're to interact and to love those who are in opposition to our God. And guess what? Esther learned that when we do this, brothers and sisters, when we go into the world, when you work at a restaurant as I have done, when you work in the real world, life gets real messy. It's a messy, broken place. Esther learned that. It's messy there. And yet, it is interesting that when we go into the Persia of our world, it may be a place of sin and danger, but it's also where God uses us there. God uses us and grows us in a place where we are open and sharing and witnessing of the grace of Jesus Christ. And there we discover a more enduring beauty described in Isaiah chapter 52, verse 7. How beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of him who brings good news, who publishes peace, who brings good news of happiness, who publishes salvation, and who says to Zion, your God reigns. Your God reigns. And the encouragement that every one of us need to hear this morning, and the encouragement that our world needs to hear, is a gospel that says Jesus Christ has finished that work. Our sin will no longer define us as a people because of Jesus Christ. We carry that beauty because of Jesus Christ. And that's the message that our world, if you see a television that is flooded with negativity, if you're wondering about this election season and, oh, how are we going to get through this crazy 2020? I'll tell you, we turn to Jesus. We look at Jesus and we say, he is my hope. And it is that hope that this world so desperately needs right now. Right now. No matter who we are and the choices that we make, God's providence prevails. Let us pray.